Today's video is sponsored by absolutely nobody. So today I'm going to show you how I color grade my footage on Davinci Resolve. I'm going to show you with some Canon C200 footage and some BlackMagic RAW footage, but the principles will remain the same no matter what footage you're working with. Although I'm going to show you two different techniques that I use, so one using a LUT and one where I completely create a look from scratch. If you have Resolve, feel free to try this yourself along with me. If not, then just sit back and watch. So we're going to be turning this shot of myself into this approximately, and then we're also going to be turning this BlackMagic RAW shot into something a bit more punchy like this. Painful. Okay, so if you don't know Davinci Resolve, let's say you're still working in Premiere Pro, then do leave a comment, as I'm thinking about putting together a Premiere Pro to Davinci Resolve kind of masterclass. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume that you at least know how to bring your footage in and get it onto the color page. So you've got it in the edit timeline, and now you can move on to color grading. Now, most of my color knowledge has come through either trial and error or from two specific YouTube channels that have really helped, which is Cullen Kelly and Darren Mostyn. I think that's how you say his name. So first thing we have to do is set up our node tree, our node graph. We can always change this later on, but there's a good kind of starting point I like to have, which is 6 nodes. So I'm going to do Alt S until I have 6 nodes. Apologies if you can hear the rain, it's England, so what are you going to do? Now, it's a really good tip to set up your keyboard preferences over in Davinci Resolve, keyboard customization or preferences, one of the two, and hammer in the sort of shortcuts that you want to work with, because it will save you so much time. Otherwise, you have to right click, do add node, add serial, and it just takes a lot more effort and time to do that. So I have my 6 nodes. So the very first thing we need to do is add color space transform. This is almost like, if you think of it as a sandwich where all the changes we make are like the filling. So any color grading decisions we actually want to make ourselves, we might want to add lettuce, we might want to add ketchup, but we always want to have 2 things either side. We want to have bread and a bit of butter. So we have bread, butter, all of our fillings, butter, bread. So on the first and the last node, we are going to add color space transform, which is over in the nodes effects. And what we need to do is tell Davinci Resolve what color space we worked in. So for instance, on this, I worked in a shot on the Canon C200, so Canon Cinema Gamut and Canon Log-3. And then we're going to tell it what we're about to do, what software are we working in. So you see a lot of people put this to Aram or some other color space, but that's not really the way that Davinci Resolve is meant to be worked. So we want to tell Davinci Resolve we are working in Davinci Resolve, and we want the tools and the color space to work within that world. So this is our first bit of bread and butter. Then we're going to add all of our fillings, and then we're going to have our butter and then bread. So this time, our first 2 nodes are Davinci Resolve. So, well, Davinci Wide Gamut and Davinci Intermediate. So you'll see how we have that on the output color space and output gamma on the first node, but on the last node, we have it on the input. And then we're going to always select, pretty much always select, Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4 for the output. Now this is how you are supposed to set up when you first start color grading. So let's say I shot on Aram, then I would change this to Aram Wide Gamut and, you know, Aram Log C, for instance. And that's why it's important, if you are not the shooter, if you are just an editor or the colorist, to actually know what color space it was filmed in. But the problem I have is I've experimented a lot with this setup with Canon Cinema Gamut, Canon Log-3. And I personally think there may be some sort of mistake in the curve or the color, whatever it's doing, because no matter how hard I've tried, it's always looked like it's added way too much red, way too much of everything really. So what I stumbled upon, because I was editing on my Fuji X-T3 footage, that actually telling Resolve for me that the Canon C200 is shot in F-Log works a lot better for me, for the way I like to edit. So this isn't technically correct, but it's actually worked out much better in my case. And I think that's a key thing here is we also want to start with the technical correct way of doing things, but sometimes there may be some room where we can kind of adapt and make things better for ourselves. It's a little bit different if you're going to be a colorist for Netflix and all these big shows, but when it comes to independent filmmaking, then there is that flexibility. So this is the first step we've done. We've kind of got ourselves our sandwich set up. We have a bread and a butter and the butter and the bread. And the reason we have to do this is so when other people watch our footage, it is already set in that Rec 709 color space. So monitors and TVs and phones, and there's a lot of things out there that have a Rec 709 color space. Things are actually beginning to change to P3, I think it is. So Apple is moving to P3. So this may change. We may end up going a little bit more into a slightly different color space down the line. But I mean, as you'll see, there's not really too much difference. The Rec 709 is like the safe option. It's the one that everyone tends to expect. So before we do any color grading, the most important thing is labeling. If you don't label, trust me, you'll forget. And the rule in my mind, and I think in most colorist minds, is to only do one adjustment per node. Otherwise you end up with a really messy node and it becomes very difficult to quickly make changes down the line. So I've set up a shortcut where I just hit N and then I can type in the name. It's the nodes in the middle where we're going to start making a lot of changes. That's going to get confusing. So the first node we want to label exposure. The next one, saturation. Then color balance. And we're going to enable this one skin tone. Now I'm going to add more nodes, but this is a really solid starting point. So the exposure. First off, we want to get all of our footage balanced at the right level. Now, if you don't have your waveform over here, it is this one here, and you can change it from a waveform to a histogram or vector scope. But a waveform is a really good one. In my mind, this is one I like to use. Now we're aiming for the kind of skin area, the bulk of the skin, to be somewhere around the 50 mark. So if I just scrub through, you'll see how where I move in the image, so does the waveform, and that kind of tells you which bit of the waveform we're looking at. Now this is actually in not too bad a level really. So we have the kind of highlights of the skin sitting about 65, but then we also have a lot of just the general bulk of me sitting a little bit more like 40. So I've actually got the room to adjust that to what kind of feels right. So you can see there, that's way too bright, that's way too dark. But somewhere around there, I've started to kind of get a bit more of an even spread. So in this first node, I'm also going to allow myself the contrast options. So I come over to the color wheels and I will bring the lift down, raise the gamma up, maybe a little bit more. Then you can just play around with the contrast a little bit. And if you want, you might prefer to use S-curves. So that's another way you can do this. It's the same kind of effect. I tend to keep all of my exposure and contrast in one node. You might want to change exposure and contrast separately, but for me, they are so interlinked that I tend to keep them in one node. So that's the difference, not a huge difference, but you can see one there. Now it's a very desaturated image, and what I'm about to do is going to look pretty horrendous, but I'm just going to like bump up the saturation to 100%, because that means I can now get the right color balance a lot easier. So this is where we make sure that our white balance was set correctly, or just give it that neutralness to start with. So what we're looking for here is color separation. We really want the blues to look like blue, the whites to look like white, and the reds to look like red. So right now, there's actually a lot of yellow in this image. You can see where the red is peaking a lot more in the waveform. So if I just grab this offset, you'll see how, as I swing round, that difference, that separation tends to come and go. So for me, I think this image, I'm just going to reset that so it's an easier starting point. somewhere around there-ish. And you can see on the waveform how things change as I change it. So that's a massive difference where I've suddenly got all this color information back. Beforehand, it might have looked all right to the eye, but the reality is there's a lot of yellow going on all over that image. And now I've swapped that out. So now I can go back to the saturation, I can bring that back down, and I can get it a bit more to where I want it. I actually didn't mind it where it was, to be honest, but I'm gonna just do that anyway. But I'll bring it down a little bit. And then color boost, for those of you that aren't sure what it means, it is meant to affect just the bits that are least saturated and push them up to kind of meet the more saturated parts. I don't tend to use this that much, but I do sometimes in little bits and pieces. And then I move on to the skin tone. So to do this, I will often use the vector scope instead, as this provides an indicator of where the skin tone should be. And I come to hue versus hue. This is my preferred way of doing it. Resolve has like so many different tools that all effectively do the same thing. This is just a matter of preference as to what you choose. So I'm going to select the red and yellow just to give me those markers. And then you'll see as I bring one up or down, how it affects different parts of the image in different ways. So I'm going to just move the red a little bit down. My personal preference is to actually reduce the red of skin tone a little bit and give it a tiny bit more of a, maybe like a greenish hue. And you can always fine tune over here. I tend to do this just because I find sometimes a red can look a little bit too much like broadcast or video rather than film. And then you actually notice that this one is affecting the lamp more than anything else in the image. It's affecting the jumper and bits of like my moustache, but I'm just gonna set it a little bit higher actually. It's such a subtle difference, you might not even be able to see it, but I can come back to that later on. So what I want to do now is add two more nodes. So the first one, Alt S, I'm going to label this colors, and I'm going to come back to that one. And the next one, I'm also going to do Alt P, so that will give me a parallel node. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to add two different masks. The first one is a vignette and is as it sounds. This is just to add some form of vignette. So to do that, I've gone to the mask tool and I've added a circular mask and I've selected the invert so I can affect the outside. So you can see how the outside begins to darken. So before and after, and you can always soften this off if you want. I'm just going to do it this way. So it's very subtle, but makes a difference. Now, this is where I feel people tend to overlook the power of power windows or masks, because this is how we can draw the attention to the subject of our object a lot more. And it's a very, very simple technique. So I'm going to add another mask and I'm going to soften it off. And I'm going to place it right over my face. What I'm going to do now is focus on adding some more contrast and brightness and just trying to train our eye, the viewer, to focus on the face. I'm going to do this quite quickly. I'm just going to bump up the contrast, bump up the exposure a little bit. And I might even, the shadow is just to affect just the dark parts really, but it's effectively the same as contrast. All right, well, I'll leave it like that for now, but you can see how it's a very subtle difference, but it actually has quite a lot of power. If you just kind of do it before and after, which I'm doing with Control D, by the way, you can see how the eye, as in our eye as a viewer, is drawn a little bit more easily to that bright part of the face. So what I would do is I would then go into the tracker option, and I tend to leave off 3D and sometimes even rotate. And zoom kind of depends on the complexity of what you're doing. So I'm just going to try this for now, see what happens. Hit play. Because the problem with when you add the 3D option is when you tilt your head like that, it very much begins over time to kind of warp the face tracker. Whereas by turning that off, you tend to keep it, you know, where 90% of the work is going to be. And Davinci Resolve's tracking tool is incredible. Way better than Premiere Pro. It's just so powerful and so accurate and so quick. It's not perfect, but what is? And you can see there when I move to the side how that would affect it. If I had the 3D on, it might kind of twist that mask. So this is the better way of doing it in my mind. Okay, and we're done. So that's now roughly where we're at. So I'm just gonna do a little before and after from that's how we brought it in to where it is now. So you can see that's, you know, not taken that long to get it to quite a good place. To me, this is almost like the color balance phase, and the next bit would be the color grading and the bit where we really start to change the colors how we want to see it. So I might want my reds to be a bit more of a orange, or I might want my greens to be a little bit more of a blue. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is go into the colors and just play around a little bit to try and get a bit more of a look that I want. So I'm actually quite happy with how it looks, to be honest. There's not really too much I'd want to change, but I'm feeling a little bit too much blue going on back here. So I'm going to focus on just affecting the blue. So I'm going to come to hue versus saturation, and I'm going to pick this blue here. I'm just going to see the level of what it's doing. Now, some people might want to add that blue, really give it that punch. In fact, it does look quite cool. Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to just bring it up rather than bring it down. There's also this yellow here, which is quite nice. I'd quite like to make that pop a little bit. So I'm going to choose this and just see what that is doing. So it affects quite a bit of the image really when I start to do that, but luckily not the face. I think I'm actually just going to kind of leave it quite neutral. The problem is, without going in and adding lots of more masks, you'll notice how the yellow begins to pop out in my face a little bit. What I can do is always come back to the saturation to manipulate the whole image. So the colors, I can start to really get the ratios right between the colors, and the saturation I can control the whole level of saturation. So maybe I just want to bring the whole level down a bit, but I now have my yellows and my blues popping a little bit more than I did before. So this is where I started, and this is where I'm at now. And there's two final steps that I do, and then that tends to be it. So the final two steps that I like to do is, firstly, I like to add some grain, because who doesn't like film grain? And then I just play around with the grain size and the grain strength to get it to somewhere that I like. On YouTube, you probably won't be able to see it, but this is all a matter of preference and just finding the look that you like. Quite like that, looks nice. And then last but not least, sometimes I forget to put my Pro Mist filter on, just happens sometimes. So I will add a bit of glow just to try and replicate it a little bit. Obviously there are plugins like the Enhancer, but for now, this is one way of doing it. So the main two are spread and threshold. These are the two to play around with. Threshold is kind of like the start and end point of where that globe tends to happen. And the spread is how far is it really going to affect? So you can see how intense that is. I personally also like to just maybe bring in a little bit of color into the glow. Spreading just a little too much for me. Okay, this is where we began. This is where we ended up, and to get there, if I just turn off all of these, realize I've just forgotten to label these, so I'm just going to add them before I forget what they are. Okay, so to get here, what I did, we just do a little recap, is I first off did the space transform to get it into the right working color space. Then I affected the exposure. I brought up the saturation so I can affect the balance, right, to get us to a neutral place. Then I focused on the skin tones, which is so slim here. I mean, I guess that's why people say Canon have good skin tones. So I've not really had to affect too much there. Then I've tweaked the additional colors, that anything specific I might want to add, before I have added in that focus on the face. And eventually added a little bit of glow, a little bit of grain, and we're there. So that's the Canon C200 look that I have developed. And now we're going to look at the BlackMagic because there's a little bit of a different workflow. So Davinci Resolve was created by BlackMagic, which means they have their own tools to use BlackMagic RAW, which this little shot was shot on. So we can work with BlackMagic RAW and use the processes that we've just used to create a new look. So for me, this is the look I created earlier. So I went from this to this. I'm basically gonna just walk you through that now. As you can see, I didn't label or do anything nice and neatly here. I did a very quick look, and I'm gonna walk you through how I would do it, taking my sweet ass time. So, this is how the image started off, which is very, very flat when it comes from RAW. So what we do is we come over to the camera RAW sections here, and we change decoding to clip. Sometimes it comes in as project, so go to clip so we can affect it. I'm gonna get my waveform back up and, my S-curve as well, just for the sake of it. So I'm first off going to change the ISO to 800 because it's already quite underexposed. It was a very dark day. BlackMagic cameras are not very good in low light, so I am expecting to get some noise issues, but we'll come to that when we come to it. So I've set my ISO and I am going to just raise the midpoint a little bit to kind of get it a bit closer to that 50 mark. We're still a bit under, but there's a limit to what we can do before we start to break the image. And I'm going to affect the contrast just a little bit. My goal here is not to get the complete look, it is to get it to a similar place to Canon Log-2 or Canon Log-3, whichever one I was shooting in earlier. Trying to get it to a log look. That's my approach. So I use the power of RAW to get it to a good starting point. Now where this gets different is I like to use a LUT for this. So my LUT, it's not my LUT, but the LUT I like to use is this one right here, SM Mini to Ari film. And you can see that does a great job getting it to where I want to get it to. If you want to know what that LUT is, I will leave a link below. I can't remember the name of the guy or the company that made it, but it's effectively a BlackMagic to Ari LUT. That's the goal of it. And I use it all the time on commercials. It's my monitoring LUT. So whenever I'm working on a commercial or film of my own, I tend to shoot in ProRes rather than RAW, if I'm being honest. I know RAW has a lot of power, but for me, I know if I can expose my image properly, then ProRes is fine. It's easier to work with. I get more footage for my card space. So just because a camera has a tool doesn't mean you have to use it. People get hung up on resolution and RAW and all these extra things. For me, the more important things is, am I exposing my image right? Am I lighting it right? Am I getting it as best as I can in camera whilst giving myself the flexibility on the shoot, as well as the grade? Obviously 10-bit is better than 8-bit log. Obviously ARRI color science is going to be better than other color science, and high dynamic range is going to always be preferred to a low dynamic range. But there's always a sweet spot, there's a payoff. So for me, shooting in RAW is something I don't tend to do very often, but here we are. So unlike when I'm creating my own look, when I'm using a LUT, there's two ways I would tend to do this. The first way would be to do exactly what we did with the Canon C200. I would get it to a neutral place. So let's say I was going to use a Canon C200 LUT. I would probably get rid of everything, probably from this point onwards, other than the space transform. So I would just get my color balance set. I would do my exposure, my saturation, my balance, and my space transform LUT into Rec 709. And then after that space transform, I would add the creative LUTs. This tends to be how you buy LUTs. That's how they should be, really. Often they are LUTs straight from log. So depending how well they've been built and how much the designer knows about LUTs and color space will change how scientific and actually how good that LUT is. But on the whole, that's what I would do. I would get it into this Rec 709 space with a nice even balanced look, and then I would add that LUT after, and I might just change the output with the key output qualifier. But in this case, I know this LUT works great for Blackmagic ProRes straight into a Rec 709 color space, which is why I tend to, before I do anything else, is I get my raw footage into that almost that ProRes space of, you know, a bit more detail, a bit more contrast, a little bit more color than what was there from the raw file. So I add the LUT, and then I go and create my whole look ahead or upstream of that LUT. And I'm going to do a similar thing. So I've already affected my exposure in the raw settings. However, I might want to fine tune it a little bit. And I actually like to do this using the curves when I'm shooting or when I'm editing color grading with RAW, just to try and feel out the tone, the quality of that shot. So that's kind of getting to a goodish place. So I've just given a bit more pop, a bit more contrast, but I have also introduced a lot more noise into the image. I'm going to actually bring that down a little bit. I don't think it needs to sit quite that high. Okay, that's not too bad. The noise is tolerable. I might clean it up anyway, but it's tolerable. Saturation, I actually think the saturation looks pretty good, but I'm just gonna play around anyway. In fact, I'm gonna raise it up, of course. I'm gonna raise it up so I can get the white balance to where I want it. So again, remember, I'm looking for that color separation. So that's what it was, that's what it is. You can see how by bumping up that saturation, it's easier to see there's a lot of red and orange and yellow going on in that image, whereas now I can go back and bring that saturation back down to a more pleasant level. Then the skin, I'm going to leave that for now, and I'm actually going to focus on this red jacket because it is a little over the top. An overriding theme with color grading to me is thinking of broad strokes rather than fine strokes. So if you're coming from a photography background, you might be tempted to try and mask out these things. The problem is with video, because of the movement, the more specific and narrow you try and make things, the more obvious it's going to be when that thing starts to break apart. Because as good as tracking tools are, there's always going to be an element of error, of margin. And that's why a better way to think of color grading is broad strokes. So the eye is less likely to see, you know, if you have something, for instance, like this, the eye's less likely to see the change if you're affecting things in a broader way. Whereas if you are very specific, the moment that that mask gets in or out, your eyes are going to be drawn to that change of color or brightness or whatever it is. So I'm not actually going to use a mask. What I'm going to do is go to the hue versus hue and just play with the red. You can see it's affecting the skin a bit. I'm just going to pop that skin back into a better place. So there, okay, so I've made the red a little bit less horrible in my mind, and I've also kind of kept the skin in an okay place. I'm also going to do a similar thing with the luminance. Just going to drop it a bit, try and give ourselves... Oh, that's come a bit too far on that ear there. Okay, fine, let's try the mask, let's see what happens. Right, let us see how well this works. I'm going to have rotate on. Okay, so we go back. Okay, let us try tracking that. Okay, it looks like I could space it out a bit. Try again. Okay, so that has more successfully controlled just the jumper and not the ear. So if I do a little before and after. Great, okay, I'm happy with that. And that's kind of kept it, yeah, away from the face. Nice, happy days, okay. So where am I at? Okay, so I've got my exposure, my saturation, balance, the jacket's done. I am also going to, I'm going to try that face technique. I'm just going to do a parallel node instead. So let's see if I can. I don't know how well this is going to work, this one, because the face kind of dips in and out of frame, I think. But let's have a go anyway. In fact, as I'm on the face, I'm going to affect okay, so let's see how well this works. I don't think this is going to work, but you never know. Okay, that worked pretty well. So that's what I've done there. It's very subtle, but it actually does pop a little bit more. I might actually increase that. Let's just see how that's affected everything else. So, perfect, okay. That's actually worked way better than what I thought it would. So this is why I really like doing this little power window around a face, just to draw the eye in a little bit. And then if you also wanted to do a third parallel node and do just a general vignette around the whole thing. Invert it, bring it down a little bit, soften it off a little bit. And that doesn't really need to be tracked, that can just stay. Off, on, off, on, off, on. Yeah, why not? We'll leave it. Right. So that's how I've got to this point here, and now I can go in and affect a few more specifics. And what I'm seeing is this blue in the hat, I think is giving me a bit of noise issue. So I'm going to, in a new node after the parallels, I'm going to come into hue versus sat. I'm going to just pick that because I think it is a blue, yeah. Then you can see there, if I do that, you can see actually how much blue is in that hat. I'm just going to bring it down because it doesn't need to be there. It doesn't add anything to the image other than noise. So I'm going to reduce that a bit. Okay, great. Right, now comes the difficult bit. So there is quite a bit of noise going on in this image because we've had to boost the ISO and just the whole level really, because it's a bit underexposed. What I am going to do is before the LUT, and you might want to do this after the LUT, different people have different thoughts on that. Doesn't really bother me, to be honest. I'm going to do a noise reduction. And you can see how quickly you forget to label things and how confusing that could be. So this was the vignette. This was the face. What was this one? Oh, this was the blue. This was the hat, blue hat. Okay, noise reduction. Actually, that's not very clear, is it? Okay. And then I'm going to do also grain and glow. And for me, it's really important to have grain on top of noise. And I'll show you why. Actually, this is really quite important in terms of order because Davinci Resolve works in sequence. So if I do the noise reduction first, I can clean up the kind of color issues going on. And then the grain will allow me to mask some of that noise, that more specular noise. Whereas if I do it the other way around, all I'm going to achieve is trying to clean up the grain I've just added. So let's just add that in whilst I'm here. I'm going to add it in, but I'm also going to turn it off. And then I'm going to add that final glow. Okay, so with noise reduction, you can see there's quite a bit of noise going on. There's two main ones here. There's the spatial threshold, which tends to work not very well, to be honest. And there's also the temporal threshold. This is the one I prefer to use. I give it a little blend. It's probably not the best frames, everything's out of focus. Okay, so that's no noise reduction, and that's with noise reduction. It's subtle, but it's there. I'm gonna boost it a little bit more. I think that's within a level of tolerance. You might not be able to see, but it is cleaning up some noise going on. A lot of the noise was also in the trees, so let's see if that's... So here you can see actually it's doing quite a lot to clean that up. And it's also giving it a bit of a softening effect, which I quite like. Now I'm going to add the grain because adding the grain on top hides some of that noise reduction effect and actually will help make it look a little bit more organic. Okay, so the difference is if I turn these both off, so that's what it was before, that's just the noise within the camera. And if I put them back on, you can see how it's like a different type of noise. It's a much more pleasing noise. It might be so subtle to you through YouTube that you can't see it, but here it makes a significant difference. And then finally the glow, and for this I'm going to come up where I can see the sky. I'm going to actually probably add quite a bit here. Because you know, it's like a rainy day. I'm gonna lean into that a little bit. I think I'm gonna give it a blue look. So I'm quite into the kind of cold image it's giving me. I might just bring the level down a bit. It may be a bit too much, but I'm kind of into it. So yeah, I'm actually going to leave it like that. I quite like that. Okay, so I'm going to close this. I'm going to clean that up. Oh, bloody hell. Okay, so now I can kind of do my whole before and after. So this is what we brought in, and this is how we've ended up. If I was to improve this, I might go in and fine tune the ear. There's quite a bit of red going on in the ear, so maybe I do another mask around the ear, something like that. But overall, I think that's quite a nice natural look. And at the end of the day, it was a cold run, so to have red ears is fine. I'm actually pretty pleased with how that's gone. So I'm going to turn all these off again, and I'm going to walk you through one by one. Now bear in mind, this is already with the camera raw. So actually this is what it looked like when I first put it in, because I hadn't changed anything on the raw settings. So when I then went in and added those changes, I kind of just undone my work there, but never mind. Now we just put all these back on. Well, wherever it was. Okay. So the first thing I did was get it to that log look using BlackMagic RAW. And then the next thing was I actually added that LUT, didn't I? So that kind of gave me my, effectively, that gave me my space transform area to work in. So once I'd done that, I got the exposure and the contrast to a good place. I affected the saturation so I could work on the balance, and then I fine-tuned the saturation. I didn't actually do anything with the skin one, so I left that. I worked on the jacket to turn it to a more kind of less in-your-face purple, more of a red. I popped the face with a bit of contrast and brightness, and I think I added a little bit of saturation maybe. Added a vignette, which I don't know if I love it or not, but it's there. I took out the blue from the hat, so I saved myself a bit of noise issues. I added noise reduction, I added grain, I added glow, and there we have it. That's my final look. So before, after, before, after. So that's how I color grade. If you enjoyed that, then leave a comment. If you've got any questions, do let me know. Down the line, like I say, I am thinking of doing a Premiere Pro to Davinci kind of walkthrough to show you actually how to learn one from the other and make it a lot easier for you. So on that note, I will see you soon. Ciao.